Welcome to episode 9 of the Horizon Knowledge Series on covering property costs and cost administration. This is the second to last session, so we're almost wrapping up. Like you may have seen, all the other sessions are now available on our YouTube and will continue to be available. And at the end, so after episode 10, we will be releasing, we'll have a catalog of all the slideshows that in case anybody wants them. So you can contact me or Kelly, and we'll be able to send those over to you after next week, after the 10th episode. We just want to get them all together, make sure all the content's in them, you'll get the value out of them that you need. Those are all the housekeeping notes on my end. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Sean. You can take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ian. As usual, Ian Newman is your host. He's in the digital marketing team, and I'm Sean Benson in the training and consulting service team. And we're going to be presenting Archibus's property and cost information today. It's a focus on the cost administration application, but there's actually 4 or 5 applications that we're going to look at the kind of a big picture view of what you're doing with income and expenses within the organization that are related to the facilities. This is the 9th of 10 total series. In the next series, we're going to be talking about home pages and metrics and making the system actionable. But today, we're going to focus on the opportunity around costs, income, expense, those types of things. And as usual, we'll talk about 2 sets of steps, a series of steps on what your day-to-day administration of costing is in Archibus. And then the second set of steps is what do you have to do to get it set up and running. So first, I think we'll just talk a little bit about an opportunity that that you have using facilities management software, and it comes in, I think, 2 different places. One is reducing the overall cost of occupancy, and one is about recovering costs from internal tenants or organizations. If you look at this picture, there's a lady here who's on her phone. She's got her laptop in front of her, but she's obviously in front of a coffee shop. And recently I was thinking about this because I was going to the gym, and my gym has even created a little cafeteria, and people are coming in there with their laptops, and rather than coming in, going to the gym and working out and leaving, they're spending 4 or 5 hours there, doing some work, taking a break, working out, and going and leaving. And so it's just funny now, today's world, that with a flexible workspace, you really aren't going into an office anymore, especially after COVID. And almost every organization worldwide is having to figure out what to do with their employees in this flexible working scenarios. So not only are people working from home, where maybe you have to kind of supply them with a laptop and a desk and some ergonomic chairs or something, but in some cases they're working they're working out of a gym or out of a coffee shop or on the beach, wherever it might be. And basically all of the costs that you were having before and putting into your facilities, your buildings where people were coming to sit and stay, all those costs are being borne by somebody else, whether it be Starbucks or the gym or whatever it might be. So it's really important nowadays to really focus on not just how to get people into the office and working in the office and working from home and being able to do that, but also now reanalyzing what's going on in terms of costs. What are your facilities costing you? What is it costing you to be using your current infrastructure, and how are you going to scale that back now that people are working from home? Because maybe they're not going to come back in like you thought they were going to. So there's a huge opportunity right now across the entire globe to reduce your overall costs. You don't need to have 3 buildings in the same city. You might be able to get away with 1 headquarters in the city, and you might be able to sell off the other ones or lease them out to other groups to kind of recover some of those costs. And even if you do have costs, it's important to be able to understand who's using your space, who's using up parts of the facility, how much are they using, and do you want to kind of encourage them to maybe use a little bit less? And in that way, you can maybe recover costs. We have some organizations who actually bill internally their departments for the real estate that they use, especially government agencies who are overseeing other government agencies have a lot of contracts in place and agreements with those agencies to actually pay for the space. So being able to track all of this and being able to track which direction this money is coming from or going to is really important. And the reason why is because if you can track by facility, you can look at which facilities really are necessary and which maybe are not so necessary for your operations. So there's a huge opportunity right now in terms of with this flexible work after COVID and everything. And the idea with a system like Archibus is you have this capability with your system to capture all of this operational data that you're tracking month to month, day by day, and turning it into something that you can go to your management with and say, hey, we have some very high capital costs, or we have some very high operational costs. And I know why. It's this one particular building or this one particular site. So what Archibus does, as you can see on this screen from the application called Strategic Financial Analysis, is it looks at all of the different metrics, or a variety of metrics related to individual buildings or properties, or even projects. And it says, what is the overall cost of this item? What is the occupancy percentage? What is the overall square footage? What does that break down into rent? How old is this facility? And so building by building, you can see all of these metrics, and then you can compare that and roll those numbers up to something that the finance can understand. So on the left-hand side of the screen, for example, you're looking at basically what would represent a profit and loss statement and your financial statements. These are not necessarily obviously coming from the financial system, but they should be a bridge between your operational data that you're doing in Archibus, building by building, and ultimately what the financial group is trying to look at in terms of your capital expenses, your operational expenses, and everything else. And if you can kind of say, look, I know why these things are so high. I know I have a recommendation for how we can get out of these and lower these rates, then you're, I think, in a good position. And you can use the system to do that. So Archibus, if you're using things like real estate and space and maintenance, it can actually aggregate a lot of these costs and roll them up into a page like you see here, where you can break down and look at specific costs by the type of cost, by the expense type, and then drill into specific buildings and locations to see what's happening with those, and are the metrics going down or going up, and is that good or bad? So I think that's kind of what you're looking for with the system, if you could take advantage of all parts of it. And just to explain a little bit how Archibus works and what we're talking about, we're really talking about tracking all these expenses and income that you might typically have within a facility's operation. For example, if you have rent that you have to pay or that is incoming for you, if you've got taxes, you have energy bills and utilities, all of your service fees for maintenance, for cleaning, for janitorial, for landscaping, you name it, all those things need to be tracked by location in order to understand the full or total cost of occupancy and ownership of that location. And this includes even project costs. So if you're doing all this with Archibus, you can kind of keep track of these things and aggregate them at the end. And of course, some of you who are lucky enough will also have income coming in from rent as well, so that will offset some of your costs. But what Archibus does is it keeps track of all of these individual monthly or weekly, yearly transactions for you. And then what it can do is it can go through a process of chargeback. And chargeback is where Archibus basically breaks out a cost by year or by month, and it divvies it up amongst the group that's responsible for that cost. So if it's a tenant in an owned property and you're leasing the space to that tenant, the tenant is you can charge back costs of the property maintenance to the tenants in the property. If you have an owned building or a leased building and you have costs or expenses associated with that, and you want to charge back those costs to individual departments based on the amount of space that they use, you can do that as well. And so these are what we call chargeback scenarios in Archibus. There's a little example that came from the help text on the right-hand side of the screen here, which basically gives you an idea for how it works. So what happens is you put a transaction into Archibus for income or expense, and you associate that transaction with an asset, right? A building or a property, maybe it's a lease contract, and in some cases it might even be a parcel of land. And that expense is tied to that particular asset. And then what Archibus allows you to do is identify, who's using that asset, what tenants are using the asset, what departments are within the asset using space in this case, and you can choose to charge back that cost. So here, for example, we have an expense amount, I don't know if you can see it, of $500. It's due on every month for this particular building, for this service. And what the Archibus will do is we'll divide that $500 by the two tenants that are leasing the space from you. So one tenant is leasing 60% of the space, and the other tenant is leasing 40% of the space. And so you can set up an agreement so that Archibus charges one of those tenants $300 of the $500 and the other tenant $200 of the $500. And then you can run reports based on the tenants and what they owe, based on you and what that property owns. And you can keep track of, by location, who owes what to whom. So it's kind of interesting. And there's actually about 4 different chargeback scenarios that I'm showing here on my screen. One is there's actually no chargeback, meaning that you just bill the asset, whatever it is that the expense is. So let's say that building is just going to eat that expense. You'll bill the cost of that expense to the building, and that's it. But if you are going to use the chargeback, then there are 3 different scenarios for that. One is to roll up or assign all of the expenses to the land or the property that the buildings are on, and then divvy them up amongst the buildings to identify which buildings are more costly than others. The second option is to assign your expenses or roll them to the properties and then divide them up amongst the leases that are leasing out that property and buildings. And then the last is usually for example, for a leased property, you can assign the leases and divide them up amongst the departments, your internal departments that are associated with those leases. And basically what the system does is it kind of allocates these costs to these different assets, and then you can report on the assets at different times. So if you want to see what's the overall cost of running this building, you can do that. And what are the overall costs that each tenant in the building is responsible for? What's that, prorated portion? You can find that out as well, because the system will kind of calculate that. So that's basically what's happening with Archibus in terms of costs and roll up and chargeback. And there's a few applications that you might be wanting to use to kind of work together to keep track of all these costs. The ones that we're kind of focusing on today are cost administration and then chargeback and invoicing. Those are the typical 2 that you would use to kind of track your regular income and expense transactions in Archibus. But also, if you happen to be using maintenance and energy management in Archibus, project management, even asset management, all of the individual prices and costs that you put into those modules, as I said, those can be aggregated along with all of the costs in the the cost administration module, and viewed in that strategic financial analysis dashboard that I showed you. So you can roll all that stuff up by building or by property and then compare it, to those financial statements that you're looking at. So if you use all of these together in Archibus, if you have licenses for all these, it makes sense to kind of do that aggregation and look at things across the entire portfolio to see how each individual unit or asset is performing versus its peers. So what are the steps? What are the training steps to get this up and running? Well, first of all, like I said, day to day, all you're doing is about these 6 steps that you see on the screen. One is you generally go out, month to month, and you schedule. This is a term that we're using here. We schedule what we call recurring and one-off income and expense transactions, and we call these in Archibus scheduled costs. So I'm going to introduce a little bit of vocabulary here, but these are basically, it means that you've got something that happens every single month, and when it gets time to come to that month, you want to create a record for each income and expense transaction so you can keep track of it. And the reason for that is that month to month, those things might change slightly, and you might have to edit that individual record and keep track of it because, month to month, the actual amount might slightly differ from what you expect. So we schedule those recurring and one-off income and expenses. And then if you are using that strategic financial analysis console that I showed earlier, you then might aggregate and forecast costs. So that's a function of the console. I'll explain that maybe a little bit later. But basically what that does is it also generates additional scheduled costs based on, for example, loans that you might have out on the property, forecasted taxes and things like that. So those would also be included in the regular expenses that you're already tracking. And then once you've created these scheduled costs, all you have to do is approve them, and the system then generates a status for each of these actual costs of either receivables for income or payables for expenses. And we call these in Archibus actual costs. Once you have your actual costs approved, meaning they're not going to change, they're going to be paid like that or they've been paid, then you can do 2 things. One is you either generate invoice amounts for your receivables, right? So anything that's set up as income, you can assign to an invoice and generate an invoice for. Now, obviously, Archibus is not a financial system, so I don't mean to say that you are creating invoices with Archibus. All I'm saying is you're generating the invoice amounts, which you'll probably end up sending to a financial system for actual invoicing. And the second option you have is to generate chargeback for the payable. So if you have expenses and you want to identify the accountable party, whether that's the tenant or the internal department, then you can charge back that as well. And of course, lastly, day to day, what you're doing is looking at your cash flow. If you have the financial analysis console, you're going to be reviewing that to look at the performance of different assets, and then just manage that, to manage those costs as well as you can. In the second set of steps that we'll talk about, we're going to talk about preparation. So what are the one-time steps that you have to go through in Archibus to make all this work day to day? Well, that includes these 7 steps here. One is to initially develop your inventory, which probably many of you already have done. What that means is, creating records for properties, which is land, billboards, anything that you might have financial transactions associated with, tax transactions. Your parcels, buildings, even the space within your buildings, because if you want to fairly charge back the space to different departments, you'll need to know how much they use, so you'll need to know how much space you have. And of course, leases as well. So leases represent quite a few income and expense transactions in their own right. Secondly, and optionally, again, if you want to kind of aggregate all those costs into that console, then you might want to use or track expenses in asset management, in the maintenance application, in the project management application, and even in the utility energy application, because all of these applications can be used to generate scheduled costs within the cost administration application. Secondly, and again, optionally, if you want to tie all of this back to your actual organization's chart of accounts, you can import your chart of accounts and make sure that every time you generate a cost, it's associated with an account from your chart of accounts. So again, you can translate what's happening in your system to the financial system if you need to, and you can almost set this up as a sub-ledger of your financial system. And then for the purpose of Archibus, Archibus needs you to define what we call cost categories and types. So this is the way that you're going to be doing reporting on costs within Archibus. There is something called chargeback agreements, which again I'd say is optional, but it's a useful way of, again, assigning accountability or responsibility to your tenants or the owner or the landlord to determine what percentage of the cost they're going to be responsible for. So they don't have to pay a full cost. You don't have to pay something full. You can set up a shared cost where one of you pays 50%, the other one pays 50%, and so on. And then if you need to, again, do invoicing and things like that, or if you have leases, you'll need to have contacts associated with all those. There is a contact table, which is separate from employees and vendors and so on. And you'll have to set up those contacts for all your real property transactions. And then lastly, and probably this is the most important thing to do, is you actually enter in all of the expected costs that you have. I call them budgeted costs. So in Archibus, we call them recurring costs, but they really are a budget. You're identifying that you have a certain rent for each building. You have an expected utility charges for each building. You have expected maybe project expenses and everything else, and you want to kind of identify those. You can identify those with what we call recurring costs in Archibus, and that's the real crux of the application are those recurring costs. So once those are done, then your day-to-day goes back to these steps here. So let's kind of quickly take a look at these steps. We'll hop into the system and see how it works. So here we are in Archibus. I log in, and I'm going to go through those same steps that we just talked about. So the first step day-to-day that you're going to be doing is you're going to be using the real property application and the cost application to run through the wizard for scheduling and approving your regular costs. So I'm just going to hide the navigator here on the left. And what you do with the wizard basically is you select, by location. For example, if I wanted to look at United States, you select the United States. You can drill into a particular city. I'll drill into Philadelphia here. And based on the selection that I'm choosing on the left here, the right-hand side of the screen is going to filter down on all of the income and expenses that I have associated with that asset. So here, as you can see, we have examples of land under Philadelphia, and as part of that land, you have parcels that make up the land. You have buildings that make up the land. The buildings may have tenants. They might have leases associated with them. So all of the different financial assets that you have related to your property and facilities will be in this tree, in this hierarchy. And your job is to basically, as we said, regularly look at each of these items and schedule these out so that you can generate, month to month, your the costs that you're going to be managing. So we'll start, for example, with, I'll just take the whole city. What you'll start by doing is you'll select the different costs that you want to generate for the next month. If we want to do them all, we can just select them all, and we say schedule. And all scheduling does is it says, how far in advance do you want to schedule this? Well, I'm in June. So let's say you normally probably do this at the end of the month. You want to schedule everything out that's due between now and the end of July. So I'll click on schedule costs, and it will generate a series of records based on this recurring schedule that you've created, and the records that I can now go and manage. So as all my bills come in, as the rents come in, as payments come in, I can kind of keep track of those things. Oops. Choosing all of them probably wasn't the smartest thing to do all at once, but we've done that. So you just press the button, and Archibus will let you schedule just up to 3 months in advance. So you can't go beyond 90 days with this scheduling tool, but you'll do that. And what it does is it's going through all of these different individual costs here for you. As you can see, electricity, electrical and plumbing costs, fire expenses, water and sewage, travel, removal, and so on. All of those different things associated with these, with this land, the parcels, the building, etc. And it's going to generate a record for each of those for the month of June, probably July in this case as well. So I think I've probably done about 2 months worth. And all I do now is just kind of manage those costs. I update the actual amounts, and when I'm done, I go through to the next tab on the screen here, and I click on approve. So we approve the costs. And once those costs are approved, they become historical. So here I am on the approved screen. You can see again, I've got depreciation, I've got interest, I've got taxes, all sorts of different things that you can keep track of in the system. And all you're doing each month is, number one, schedule the costs. So I've just done that for a month or so in advance. And as I get each cost, I can edit the amount if I need to. In this case, it's a leasehold improvement expense for $81,000. If that's exactly what it was, I'm good to go. I don't have to do anything, but I can approve this. If there's a slight change, like I got the bill and it's not 81,000, it's 80,989 or something like that, I can update that individual scheduled cost to reflect the real cost. And then when I'm done, I just go through every month and I approve those bills as needed. And what you end up with is a series of your actuals at the end of the month. And so on the third tab, you can actually go look at those actuals. So that's kind of the day-to-day management of the transactions in Archibus. And all that does is it keeps track of every single cost by a specific asset, right? By a piece of land, by a parcel, by a building, by a lease. And you can tie all of those back to those assets. And once that's done, if you want to, for example, use this strategic financial analysis console, which comes from this application, this is the console here, right? Here's the application. If you want to aggregate all of those costs up, I think I can do something for 2021. We'll see. If you want to look at all those costs and aggregate them, by location or by a specific metric and so on, then to do this, you have to go into the building or property forecasting tool and go over to the way to the right and aggregate all of your operating expenses. So what this does is it goes out to your Archibus asset application, project application, maintenance application, and it pulls in all the costs that those applications represent. And it creates those same scheduled cost records that we just looked at. So you can see here that you have here interest, costs, principal on the mortgage, and all sorts of those types of costs for your assets. And once you aggregate operating expenses by clicking on that button or manually creating a scheduled cost, they will show up on that same screen that we're just using in cost administration, the cost wizard. So then you can also treat those like your regularly scheduled costs as well, and you can approve them and get them into your system as kind of actual historical costs. Once that's done and you've approved all your costs, then like I said, then you can choose to go through that next step of charging the cost back or invoicing customers for income. And again, like we said, it's not exactly invoicing, it's really just creating the amounts that represent what you will be invoicing the customer, typically through a financial system. So to do that, those two things, you go to the chargeback and invoicing applications, and you run the chargeback cost wizard and the invoice cost wizard. So I'll quickly run the invoice cost wizard. And here what's going to happen is all of the approved costs that you just approved on that last screen, anything that was generated, anything that was a net income will have been generated as a receivable and will show up here as something that can be invoiced. So what you can do here is now assign those costs by the property to existing or new invoices. So for example, if you were pulling invoices in from your financial system, you can assign the cost to those or simply create those costs. Add a description if you want to, and then of course assign who the invoice is going to go to. So this is where your contact data comes in. You'll create contact information for your own company as well as the customer. I probably shouldn't choose the same person here. And then you can choose basic information like today's billing date, the date that it's due based on your terms, and then the terms and so on. So now what you've done is you've created an invoice, and now that invoice will show up as part of a receivables report that you can kind of manage and track or push to the financial system. So there's a whole process within the system for kind of keeping track of payments to the invoices. Even you can apply prepayments to the invoices as well if someone pays in advance. So there's a whole series of kind of functions around invoicing in Archibus that you can use. But if you're not doing that, and instead you actually want to look at the expense that you have, and you want to generate, chargeback. I don't think I've got anything here. Let me see if I've got any data there. There's one. So here's an example where some amount was generated from the energy bill or approved from the energy management application. And what you would do here is you would then take this amount and just simply run chargeback costs. And this is going to tell me about, it says I've already got some costs in here. I press save. And what it does is it generates this cost. Okay, in this case, I've got some bad data, but it basically generates those new records for those other entities to assign responsibility for that cost. And then of course you can approve those just like you did the other costs. So now what's happened is I've taken one cost for a property, I've divvied it up by lease or by department, and now I can go report on each of those leases and each of those departments to determine who's responsible for what expense in that particular facility. And that's what you're doing day to day. And as we said, the last step on our administration screen is to analyze what's happening. And for those, you have reports like the cash flow report, like the financial analysis console that I showed you. And so for example, I happen to like using the cash flow report to look at what's going on. It's pretty useful. I can run reports by building. I can run reports for just the budgeted costs or the budgeted costs plus the actuals plus the historical. So depending on how I want to run the report, I can look at a budget or I can look at the actual amounts that I'm looking for. So again, for example, if I run this report from 2018 to 2028, that's a 10-year period. I run it by year. I include both income and expenses for all my buildings. Then I get a report that will show me not only what's happened previously, but what I expect to happen in the future. This is just telling me I have to run a little application in the background to update my exchange rates. That's because I'm running the multi-currency facility within Archibus, and probably many of you will not have to do that. But if you do have multi-currency, multiple locations, you can use that function as well. So I think that's going to probably prevent me from showing that report today, but anyway, it creates a breakdown of, by building, all the expected costs by month, by year, whatever it is you choose. So that's your analysis, and there's a whole series of reports under the cost administrator for looking at lease, common area maintenance charges, costs, VAT, taxes, regular recurring costs, and so on. Okay, so day to day, that's kind of what you're going to be doing with the application. I will point out one other piece, because I said it was an optional piece, but in that building forecast function, which is where we aggregate the costs, not only can you aggregate operating expenses from applications within Archibus that you're using, like maintenance and assets, but you can also create additional scheduled costs, for which we call forecasts. So for example, if you wanted to select a particular building, there's something called forecast capital costs, where the system will allow you to generate these expected or budgeted amounts based on a loan and principal payments on the loan, or interest payments on the loan, or depreciation of an asset, or appreciation of an art or painting asset. So there's quite a few things that the system will allow you to generate as part of this whole costing application. And ultimately what you're doing is you're looking at all of your costs by asset. And that's kind of the key here. So what do you have to do to kind of get this set up and working? Well, the first thing, as we said, if we go back to our slides, look at part 2 here. The first thing is develop your inventory, and then you can choose, what you want to keep track of. So in terms of developing inventory, that's standard Archibus. You can do that from just about any application, whether it's leases or costs or anything else. But it starts out as normal with developing, for example, the background data for locations. So I'm going to go to leases first. And you can see there's the geographical locations. This is your buildings, your floors, your spaces, things that we've already talked about. You'll also have a defined properties option here, which is slightly unique to the real property application, but it's where you can keep track of both land and structures within the system. So I tell people to use that for managing parcels of land, or parcels, obviously, when they have large parcels that work together as a particular plot of land on which an asset will sit. Or structures. For example, just about every client I work with now has to deal with telecom towers in some way. So everyone's putting telecom towers on top of a building. You've got to keep track of the tower. You've got to be able to break it into segments, lease out different levels of the tower to different cell phone providers, and keep track of the costs of the tower, the costs of the maintenance of the tower, but also the income that's coming from the providers. So that's a very common object for properties in Archibus. But you'll define those properties as well, and that's going to make up your inventory. Now, if you are going to use the other applications, like the maintenance application, you might want to enter in, your asset cost, the asset purchase price, the building market value. These are all things that you can aggregate into the strategic financial analysis application. So that's step 1, is setting up your buildings, your properties, and everything else. And there's a variety of different screens to do that, whether it's these defined geographical locations and property screens, whether you do it from the lease application and you use the lease portfolio edit wizard or the lease portfolio console. All these things allow you to kind of generate that inventory. Optionally, it said, again, the second step was to track expenses. So I'm just going to very quickly kind of show you some of the fields that are being used within the lease application within the strategic financial analysis application. So for example, if we look at the location application here and we look at a building, one of the things that you'll see on the defined building screens are things like market value. I don't see it on this particular screen, but let's go into this guy. This is the portfolio edit wizard. It's also allowing you to edit buildings and land and so on. So I'm just going to choose a building. It gives you access to a different set of fields than the screen I just was on. So I'm going to take a look at this. And as you can see, it forces you kind of to fill out things like the book value, the market value. If you do that here and you do the similar thing for equipment, Archibus will take those into account on the strategic financial analysis console. So you don't have to do that, but it's optional if you think you want to kind of aggregate all those costs and look at them on that console. The other thing that's optional that you'll have to do during the setup is to set up your chart of accounts. So if you want to kind of be able to tie, as if it were a subledger, your Archibus system back to the financial system, you might want to identify your chart of accounts. So for example, there's a few examples of charts of accounts that come out of the box. For BOMA, you would identify the different cost groups within that chart of account, and then you'd identify the different accounts within Archibus that you're going to use. So there's the account code, for example. You have your chart of account source code, and then a description, and then any group code that you wanted to use. So this allows you to kind of tie your financial system to Archibus by setting these up. Again, that's an optional step, but if you do that, you can generate all of your transactions and associate them with an account. So the most important thing within Archibus is actually to create cost categories and types. Now, cost categories and types, they are associated with something that Archibus calls a cost class. And again, these are usually set up out of the box, and I think generally speaking, a lot of clients will just use what's out of the box. Things like cleaning is set up as an operating expense out of the box with Archibus. Your garage and maintenance is an operating expense. Your interest in some ways is an income. Maintenance is an operating expense. So there's a whole series of cost classes in Archibus that kind of are used to report on these things that you're going to be looking at. But what you have to focus on is what categories of cost do you want to keep track of? Now you might think, well, isn't that the chart of accounts? Well, it can be a chart of accounts. It can be very similar to that, but it can also be much more detailed. It can give you subgroupings of those charts of accounts, so you can really get into the detail, as much detail as you need. So this is where people come in and create their own set of, cleaning categories. Maybe they want to break out not just cleaning, but electrical plumbing equipment, carpet cleaning, contractual cleaning, the daily cleaning services, labor. They might want to break all these things out separately to kind of look at the details, and that you can do with cost categories. And as we saw, cost categories are associated with this cost class, and of course there are types and super classes to use for reporting. The key thing about cost categories is if you're going to do this chargeback function that I mentioned, it's the cost category that's associated with the chargeback type. So this is where you have to put a little bit of thought in with your service provider, with Horizon, for example. When you look at each of these cost categories, you want to determine, are we going to assign these directly to whatever entity is going to be responsible for them, like the building or the lease? Or do we want to ultimately charge them back to a tenant or a department? If you think you're going to charge back, then you want to make sure that you choose a cost category that will be prorated, right? So in most cases, the cost category default will be to assign to all, prorate to bill direct, which basically means you're just going to create the cost, and that entity is going to be responsible for that cost, however that works. But if you want to do a chargeback, then there's these options that, as we said, will prorate to the lease. So there's three options here for leases: either buildings prorate to leases or properties, or you might want to prorate to departments. So you might set up the cost. It might be a leasing expense that you want to share or divide up amongst all the departments in the building. So those are the things. The prorate to column is what you're really looking at to determine chargeback. Now, there's another column here called rolls up to, and what that does is basically more for reporting. So if you don't want to see an expense by a particular building, you want to include all of the buildings on a site or on a property, on a piece of land, to kind of accumulate together, you can choose a roll up value as well without charging it back, just to make sure that the correct entity is taking the responsibility for the cost. So this takes a little bit of getting used to when you start using the system, but if you work with Horizon on the implementation, they'll help you out to get that right. But this is where kind of it's key to help you with chargeback and determine, who is responsible for what costs and what location is, responsible for all the costs in the system. So this is a key field for setting up Archibus and making it work for you to reduce those costs. Secondly, if in chargeback, you might want to also create chargeback agreements, lease chargeback agreements. This is not a requirement, but it is just another feature. So for example, if you have agreements with your tenants or with your landlord on who is going to pay what portion of different types of expense, then after you set up your cost categories, for each lease agreement or contract that you have, you can set up a cost category and a charge type. So you can choose to directly charge that client. You can choose to charge them a fixed rate, or you can be charged a fixed rate based on some value that you enter, or you can choose to charge a percentage of the expense for the rate. So again, this is lease by lease. You can set up these chargeback agreements so that if the cost comes in and you're not going to pay, or they're not going to pay the full amount, you can identify exactly what it is they're going to be responsible for. So that's part of the system. I also said that you need to define any contacts. So obviously, if you are going to do chargeback, if you are going to have leases, if you're going to have tenants, you do need to identify the real property contacts that you have. So this is a fairly simple table. You just keep track of a contact code, what type of contact it is, telephone numbers, email addresses, company addresses, and so on. So there's your contacts. And then lastly, as I said, the most important thing is to make it easy for yourself is to develop a series of budget items, right? Recurring costs that you expect over the next month, over the next 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, and so on. And that's again what we do in the cost wizard. So initially in the cost application, you'll go back in the wizard, and in the same screen that you're going to be using every day to schedule and approve costs, you can actually create recurring costs. I think I've got to choose one here to actually show the add new field. There we go. So once you select the asset that you want to create a cost for, right? Whether it has to be land, a parcel, a building, or a lease. When you do that, you get this button called Add Recurring Cost field that shows up. So remember that you have to actually select an asset to assign the cost to before the button pops up. But once you do that, you can add a recurring cost, and this is the last thing that you do. And this will help you generate those costs every month to get the transactions ready. What you do is you create, you take a cost category that you've created that you wanted to track. Let's say maintenance. I'll just choose anyone, parking maintenance expense, okay? So I'll throw in parking maintenance expense. And what you then do is identify the income amount or the expense. Now, in this case, it probably is expense because it says it in the title. So you type in the amount that you expect to pay on a regular basis. This is your budgeted amount. And then down below, you'll have a period. And the period gives you the option of monthly, quarterly, yearly, or custom. Most people are probably going to be using monthly, quarterly, or yearly, but you'll choose the period that you want to do, and you'll choose the start date and the end date for the expense or the income. So if it's kind of ongoing and it doesn't have an end date, as far as you know, then you just leave the end date blank, and the system will continue to produce those records as long as you schedule them out. So those are the fields you focus on: cost category, income or expense amount, period, start and end dates. And most of you have that in your cost administration application turned on. And once you do that, you save it. Now that creates the record that's now going to generate, that's the budget record that's going to generate all of your individual monthly transactions or yearly transactions, which is going to then produce overall your report. So if you never schedule or approve or use the system for tracking, the minimum that you can do is set up your budget and then basically run your reports off of your budget or expected budget. So that would be the minimal thing that you do to set up your Archibus costing application. So that will now create this record, and from here I can go and then approve and schedule month to month. I'm just going to point out this screen is a lot more, it has a lot more to it than what probably you're going to see when you go to use the screen. And that's because this screen is designed for, as I said, multi-currency and also VAT usage. So if you have to charge HST or VAT in some countries, or if you have multiple countries, then there's a few other things that you have to do to set up the system as well. So for example, you'll have to set up a VAT rate for each cost category, which you'll do in the administration of the system. You'll have to turn on, you'll have to enable the multi-currency function. And then of course, as you can see here, Archibus is going to calculate for you the VAT percentage and then the total amount that should be charged. And it gives you the option of overriding those when you actually create the cost if you need to. So there's a lot of different functions here. Again, this is something that we can go over when you take a training course, but the basic setup is to identify the cost that you have with the asset that's going to be accountable for that cost, the amount of the cost, and then the start and end date in the period. And that's a starting point for your cost application. And if you do that, what you're going to end up is you're going to end up with a system where you can identify the total cost by facility of all of your portfolio. And let's go back to the slide. So just to summarize what we've talked about today, Archibus allows you to keep track of income and expense by facility, asset, by location, so that you can determine how much each location is actually costing you and and generate from that a total cost of occupancy and ownership, which is important when you're looking at flexible working and you're deciding what spaces you can give up, what spaces you need to purchase, and so on. And the second thing is it allows you to assign responsibility or accountability to the organizations that use that space. You can actually tie all those costs back to your square footage, back to the square footage of the lease or the building that they're in, so that you can associate the actual expense for each tenant that they're responsible for, or the actual expense of each department that they're responsible for. So those are the things that you're basically doing with the application. And the benefits of this ultimately is that you can help reduce your costs associated with specific facilities or locations, and if necessary, recover some of those costs from tenants and internal organizations. So I hope this is, again, as usual, it's a kind of a quick run through of all the steps that you would typically do to set up Archibus for tracking costing and income and expense within the system. But if you have other questions, we're going to stick around for 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. I think we're out of time actually, but I'll stick around for 5 minutes, Ian. And don't forget, next time we have in 2 weeks, June 20th, we'll go over home pages and metrics to make your system actionable. And thank you very much, everybody. Ian?
Thank you, Sean. Like you said, a couple of weeks, we'll have the final session. And then after that, you will be able to contact us, get the downloads, all the recordings, all the presentations as well, to go back and go through them, maybe and some trainings for your own team. See, but if you have any questions about it, my email is right there on the screen, or you can pose them in the question box to me and Sean in the next couple of minutes. But I haven't seen any through the session, so I believe we might be okay, unless if you have any questions following this, like you missed something and you think you want to get a clarification, like I said, email's right there. You can email me and I will put you in contact with Sean, or answer it myself, and we'll be good to go. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.